Your career was basically glorified babysitting teenagers in uniforms, and frankly, it is not worth the budget line, the school board member announced into his microphone, smiling at the crowded room as he cast the deciding vote to cut my class. To understand how that exact same man ended up forced to read my actual 20-year combat record through clenched teeth at the biggest community dinner of the year, I have to take you back. My name is Margaret. I am 48 years old. Before I ever walked the polished linoleum hallways of a public high school in Texas, I spent 2 decades stationed on military flight lines. I served as a munitions and weapons load officer for the United States Air Force. If a strike aircraft rolled out onto the tarmac carrying anything explosive, my team was the reason it was armed, balanced, and ready for the mission. My world was defined by fractions of an inch and thousands of pounds of high explosives. When you are a master sergeant running a flight line in the Middle East, coordinating the movement of live ordnance in 110 degrees, there is zero margin for error. A mistake in that environment does not result in a bad performance review. A mistake results in a crater. The pressure teaches you how to value facts over feelings. In that environment, there is absolutely no room for ego. There is only the safety procedure, the pre-flight checklist, and the mission. If you have poured your soul into a mission only to have an arrogant person dismiss your life work with a wave of their hand, you know the exact heat that rises in your chest. And if you believe that true respect is earned through quiet grit rather than loud demands, I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel and sticking around to hear how this story ends. When I retired and moved back to civilian life, I was looking for a quiet chapter. I bought a small house with a porch light that actually worked and a garden I could tend without the shadow of a deployment looming over me. But quiet does not mean idle. When our local high school posted an urgent opening for an instructor to lead their Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, I immediately saw a new kind of mission. For 3 incredible years, I taught 70 kids how to wear a uniform, how to stand incredibly tall, and how to respect themselves. These were not the affluent students destined for Ivy League colleges. Most of my cadets were kids barely scraping by. They were kids who needed a reason to show up to school in the morning. I did not recruit for the military. I recruited for life. I taught them that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. I taught them that showing up 5 minutes early was the very first step to changing their own narrative. We operated on a shoestring budget of $24,000 a year. That covered dry cleaning for the uniforms, drill equipment, and basic charter buses to local physical fitness competitions. It was a tiny drop in the district bucket, but to a man named Marcus, it was $24,000 he wanted for himself. Marcus was a newly elected school board member. He owned a regional chain of car dealerships and treated the school district like a subsidiary of his brand. He wore tailored suits that cost more than my first car, and he had a terrible habit of interrupting women mid-sentence. Marcus had a personal pet project. He desperately wanted the district to build a massive digital video scoreboard for the football stadium, a project his auto group had publicly pledged to sponsor. To secure the matching public funds, he needed to trim the budget elsewhere. He immediately set his sights on my cadets, not because we were a massive financial burden, because we did not serve his personal brand. Marcus did not like me. I knew it from our very first interaction. 2 months into his term, he toured the high school and strutted into my classroom right in the middle of a formal inspection drill. He tried to crack a loud joke about my students looking like little tin soldiers. I did not laugh. I simply stared at him calmly, told him we were in the middle of a graded exercise, and asked him to either observe quietly from the back wall or step outside. Marcus was a man who required constant flattery. Being asked to step aside by a woman he viewed as a glorified gym teacher bruised his fragile pride. From that day forward, the cadet program was squarely in his crosshairs. He began requesting endless audits of my classroom. He demanded spreadsheets on uniform depreciation. He aggressively questioned why we needed $2,000 for a regional drill meet bus charter. I answered every email with polite military precision, facts over feelings. I provided the receipts, the daily attendance records, and the drastic grade improvements of my cadets. I proved on paper that graduation rates for the at-risk kids in my program were 20% higher than the overall school average. It did not matter. He had already made up his mind. The final showdown happened on a Tuesday night in late October. The school board meeting was packed. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the community center where the folding chairs were arranged. I sat quietly in the second row, holding a manila folder containing letters from parents detailing how the program had completely turned their children around. I had prepared a 5-minute statement. I wore my best dark service suit, ready to plead my case professionally. I never even got to read my statement. When item number 7 came up on the agenda, Marcus took over. He leaned into his microphone, tapping a gold pen against the table. He did not look at the other board members. He looked directly down at me. He painted a picture of a school district bleeding money, claiming we needed modern athletic facilities to attract students. He called my program an outdated relic. Then he delivered his killing blow. He leaned forward, flashing a perfectly white, entirely empty smile. That was when he said it. He looked at my 20 years of leading troops and arming combat aircraft, and he called it glorified babysitting teenagers in uniforms. He told the room my class was a massive drain on the taxpayers and an embarrassment to the modern curriculum. Silence settled over the room. A few parents shifted uncomfortably in their metal chairs. The high school principal, a good man named Thomas, frowned deeply from his seat on the bleachers, but he was legally bound by the board authority. Marcus called for the vote immediately. He needed 4 hands in the air. He got 5. Just like that, the budget for my program was completely zeroed out for the upcoming spring semester. I did not yell. I did not stand up and cause a dramatic scene. In the military, when you are unexpectedly ambushed, panic gets you killed. You assess the blast radius, you secure your position, and you plan your next move. I simply closed my manila folder, stood up, and walked out of the double doors into the cold rain. Marcus thought he had won. He assumed I would formally resign by Friday. He assumed a retired veteran teaching high school was someone who would just quietly fold away when a powerful man in a nice suit told her it was over. He made a catastrophic miscalculation. Sometimes people mistake silence for surrender. Sometimes they mistake discipline for weakness. I went to school the next morning and taught my classes as if nothing had happened. My cadets had already heard the terrible rumors. A sophomore named Daniel tentatively asked me if it was true if they all had to turn in their uniforms. I refused to let them see me sweat. I looked Daniel in the eye, told him our mission had not changed, and instructed him to tuck in his shirt and fall in line. But by Friday afternoon, the harsh reality of the board vendetta landed squarely on my desk. I walked into the staff mailroom after the final bell. Sitting in my cubby was a thick white envelope bearing the seal of the district superintendent. It was not a polite request. It was an executive directive signed by Marcus himself as the facilities committee chair. Because the program was officially defunded for the spring, I was no longer authorized to use district facilities for any cadet activities. The letter gave me exactly 14 days to clear out my classroom, pack up all my files, surrender every single district-purchased uniform, and turn in my keys. 14 days. When you have spent 2 decades organizing the tactical movement of heavy artillery, managing complex supply chains across global combat zones, and ensuring aircraft have the exact munitions they need to fly, 14 days is not an emergency. In the military, we call that a luxurious timeline. Logistics is simply the science of moving the impossible from point A to point B. I did not march into the superintendent office and demand a hearing. I did not send a fiery email to Marcus. Not because I was afraid of a fight, because I knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted a public scene. He wanted to look like the calm, rational executive managing an emotional, disgruntled employee. He desperately needed a screaming match so he could justify his vote to the angry parents. I refused to hand him that script. Instead, I treated the eviction notice like a sudden forward deployment. I brought in a stack of empty cardboard boxes and a heavy roll of packing tape. I took down the unit flags. I emptied the filing cabinets. I washed, pressed, and hung every single district-purchased uniform in heavy canvas garment bags. I left the classroom completely spotless, turning in my brass key to the front office exactly 3 days before his deadline. Marcus and the school board thought they had severed the head of the snake. They assumed the cadets would just scatter into the wind, blending back into the crowded hallways to be forgotten. They profoundly underestimated the kids. And they profoundly underestimated my background. Because the district had cut the official cadet class from the academic schedule, my principal quietly reassigned me to teach freshman physical education and state history to run out the remainder of my annual contract. Thomas was a good man, furious about the board decision, but his hands were legally tied by the budget vote. That reassignment was a lifeline. It kept me in the building. It kept me in contact with my kids. For the cadet program, we simply moved the operation entirely off the grid. I pulled my cadet leadership team aside on a Tuesday afternoon. We met by the old metal bleachers behind the football stadium, completely out of sight. I did not sugarcoat the situation. I told them the official program was dead. But I also told them that true discipline does not require a taxpayer-funded classroom. It only requires a mission. Every afternoon when the final school bell rang, my 70 remaining cadets would walk 3 blocks down the public sidewalk to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. The post commander, a retired Army tank mechanic named Henry, had heard about the board vote. He gave us permission to use their massive asphalt parking lot for free, indefinitely. We did not have formal district uniforms anymore, so I went to a local discount store and spent $300 of my own savings on plain navy blue polo shirts. The kids wore those shirts with cheap khaki pants. They looked sharp. They looked ready. We could not afford to charter buses to state drill competitions anymore, so we shifted our focus entirely to local community service. We cleared overgrowth from the town cemetery. We picked up litter along a 3-mile stretch of the interstate highway. We painted over graffiti on the brick walls behind the municipal library. We operated quietly. We stayed out of his way. During those long, difficult months, I maintained one deeply personal ritual. Every Sunday evening, long after my neighborhood went dark, I sat at my small kitchen table. I would pour a single mug of black coffee, turn on the overhead porch light, and handwrite a letter. I addressed the thick envelopes to a military post office box overseas. I never told the other teachers who I was writing to. I never told Thomas. It was a quiet lifeline. My correspondent was someone who had sat in those exact classroom desks 4 years earlier. Someone who knew exactly what the program meant to a kid with absolutely no other options. I wrote to him about the budget cuts. I wrote to him about the new navy blue shirts. I kept him updated on the cadets, the funny things that happened during drill practice, and the profound pride I felt watching them grow. I never expected the long responses that would eventually come back written on cheap military stationery, but writing those letters kept me grounded. It reminded me why I refused to quit. Winter thawed into early spring. The program survived purely on grit cheap coffee and the stubborn pride of teenagers who refused to be discarded. But Marcus was a man who needed complete submission. He did not just want my budget. He wanted my absolute obedience. He was completely unaware that my cadets were still drilling. He was too busy posing for photographs at the high school football stadium, pointing to the exact spot where his brand new digital scoreboard would soon be installed. Overconfident people always stop looking at the perimeter. They assume the battle is over the exact second they declare victory. But our town was not that big, and 70 teenagers marching in unison are incredibly hard to hide. It was only a matter of time before our paths crossed. It happened on a bright Saturday morning in April. I had organized a massive cleanup effort at the town historical park. 30 of my cadets were spread out across the green grass, wearing their matching navy polo shirts, raking leaves, painting over rusted benches, and hauling heavy trash bags. They were laughing, working hard, and looking out for one another. They were a machine of discipline and community pride. I was standing near the curb checking off names on a clipboard when a massive silver luxury sports utility vehicle pulled up right behind my pickup truck. The engine cut off. The heavy door slammed. It was Marcus. He was wearing a pastel golf shirt and dark sunglasses. He had been driving to the country club down the road, and he had spotted our highly organized formation from the avenue. He did not say hello. He marched straight across the grass, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft dirt, and stopped inches away from me. He looked at the teenagers hauling trash, and then he glared down at me. He demanded to know what exactly I thought I was doing. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told him we were doing community service. I pointed out that we were on public property, volunteering our weekend to clean up the town park. Marcus leaned in his face, turning an ugly shade of red. He lowered his voice so the cadets could not hear, but his tone was absolute venom. He told me I was playing a very dangerous game. He said those kids were district students, and because I was technically a district employee teaching an unsanctioned, unapproved group activity, I was creating a massive legal liability for his school board. I did not argue. I simply marked a check on my clipboard. I stared back at him. I reminded him that it was a Saturday and my contract did not dictate who I could volunteer with on my own time. He smiled that entirely empty smile again. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. He told me that if I did not disband my little rogue militia by Monday morning, he would personally call an emergency board session. He promised me he would not just fire me. He promised he would petition the State Board of Education to permanently revoke my teaching license for insubordination and endangering minors. Mark my words, Margaret, you will never set foot in a classroom in this state again. He turned on his heel, walked back to his heavy silver vehicle, and drove away. I stood alone by the curb, the cold wind biting through my jacket. The clipboard suddenly felt incredibly heavy in my hands. I knew he was not bluffing. Losing my job was one thing. I had my military pension. I would never go hungry. But having my state teaching credential permanently revoked was a completely different level of destruction. It meant I would be legally barred from stepping foot inside any public classroom in Texas. It meant I would lose the only true mission I had found since hanging up my uniform. The threat hung over my head as I drove home that Saturday afternoon. Marcus was an incredibly petty man, but he was also a man who understood leverage. As the head of the facilities committee and the loudest voice on the school board, he possessed the political capital to ruin my post-military career over a simple technicality. I had until Monday morning to fold my hand, to disband my cadets, and to walk away quietly. When you have spent 20 years managing the tactical logistics of live combat munitions, you learn a fundamental truth about aggressive ultimatums. When a superior officer begins issuing wild threats about your permanent destruction, they are not acting from a place of tactical strength. They are acting from a place of profound insecurity. Marcus was terrified. He was terrified that a group of kids sweeping a park in cheap blue shirts made his multi-million-dollar digital scoreboard project look incredibly shallow. But he still had the legal leverage. I parked my truck in my driveway, walked inside my quiet house, and checked my metal mailbox. Resting at the very bottom was a thick white envelope with a blue and red airmail border stamped by a military post office overseas. It was a reply from my Sunday evening correspondent. I made a fresh pot of coffee, turned on the porch light, and carefully opened the seal. I slid out 3 pages of cheap lined notebook paper covered in rushed handwriting. It was from a young man named Elias. 4 years ago, Elias had been a deeply angry high school sophomore. He was failing 4 classes, he had been suspended twice for fighting, and the school counselors were preparing the paperwork to permanently expel him. The system had entirely written him off. But I refused to let him fail. I pulled him into the cadet program. I put him in charge of our equipment inventory. I gave him a uniform, a massive responsibility, and a structured path. I watched that terrified defensive boy transform into a focused, disciplined leader. Now, Elias was a sergeant in the United States Army, forward deployed with a rapid response infantry unit. In his letter, Elias wrote about his recent promotion. He wrote about leading a squad of young soldiers, telling me he used the exact same phrases I used to tell him when he was struggling to complete a physical training drill. But the final page of his letter stopped me completely. He had received my previous letters explaining the devastating budget cuts and the loss of our classroom. His response was raw. He wrote that my class was the only reason he was not currently sitting in a state penitentiary. He wrote that the strict, unyielding discipline I instilled in him was exactly what kept him and his soldiers alive during a difficult combat rotation. He asked me to promise him that I would not let the school board erase the program. I folded the letter carefully. The fear about losing my teaching credential completely evaporated. I realized something crucial in that exact moment. Marcus was attacking me through the administrative bureaucracy. He thought my only defense was arguing with him in a sterile committee room where he held all the votes and controlled the microphone. I realized I did not need to fight him in his arena. I just needed to change the battlefield. First thing Monday morning, I walked straight into the principal office before the first bell rang. Thomas was sitting behind his heavy oak desk. He was a quiet, careful man who had spent the last 6 months watching Marcus use the school district as a personal vanity project. I sat down in the chair opposite him. I did not complain about the threat to my license. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out the letter from Sergeant Elias, and handed it across the desk. Not because I wanted him to fight my battles, because I needed him to understand exactly what was at stake if we surrendered. I told him to read it. Thomas put on his reading glasses and scanned the 3 pages. The room was perfectly quiet except for the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. When he finished, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at me with a profound, quiet sadness. He said it was an absolute tragedy that men like Marcus held the purse strings, while young men like Elias were out there doing the actual heavy lifting for our country. Then Thomas looked out his window toward the empty football stadium. A strange, sharp look crossed his face. He leaned forward and asked me a very specific question. He asked if my official military service record was unclassified and available for public review. I told him it was. My discharge papers and my service summary were a matter of public record. Thomas nodded slowly. He did not explain why he asked. He just smiled a small, tight grin and told me not to worry about my teaching license. He promised he would handle Marcus on the administrative side. He told me to keep running the weekend drills to keep the kids engaged and to completely ignore the board member. I left his office and went back to teaching state history, trusting my ally. but I had no idea what Thomas had just set into motion. He spent the rest of his Monday morning quietly compiling a massive nomination packet for the town annual Veteran of the Year award. The civic dinner was the single most prestigious event in the county, heavily sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce. Thomas pulled my full, unredacted 20-year combat logistics record. He included my deployment dates, my performance commendations, and a detailed account of the massive quantities of high explosives my team managed during our overseas tours. He included the exact statistics of how my cadet program had elevated at-risk youth in the town, proving our graduation rates were unmatched. And as the final piece of undeniable proof, Thomas attached a typed copy of the 3-page letter from Sergeant Elias. He drove the thick envelope directly to the downtown Chamber of Commerce and handed it to the Independent Selection Committee. What they would do with my unredacted service file was completely out of my hands. But as the days ticked closer to the massive civic dinner, Marcus began to panic about his own political future. Because it was an election year, Marcus was heavily focused on his upcoming run for the city council. He desperately needed high-profile media coverage to launch his campaign. He needed a photo opportunity that screamed patriotism and community leadership. Something to distract from the angry parents complaining about school budget cuts. So he aggressively maneuvered behind the scenes. He called in massive political favors, leveraged his auto group sponsorships, and bullied his way onto the gala organizing committee. He made it very clear that if his dealership was going to continue funding city events, he required a highly visible role at the most important dinner of the year. He successfully demanded to be named the honorary chairman of the award ceremony. He secured the exclusive right to stand alone on the main stage under the bright spotlights. He demanded the glory of presenting the award to whatever wealthy local donor or retired general the independent committee had chosen. And above all else, he demanded that when the time came, he would be the only man allowed to hold the sealed presentation folder, completely blind to the name resting inside. The threat to my teaching license completely evaporated 3 days later. It happened quietly delivered through a thick, cream-colored envelope resting in my staff mailbox. The envelope was sealed with the heavy gold crest of the local Chamber of Commerce. Inside was a formal typed letter addressed directly to me. The city was officially requesting the high school cadet program to provide the honors color guard for the opening ceremony of the annual Veteran of the Year civic dinner. The mayor had personally signed the request, asking for 4 cadets to present the state and national flags before the keynote address. The letter explicitly stated that my presence as their commanding chaperone was required. I stood in the quiet mailroom, staring at the gold seal, realizing the absolute brilliance of what Thomas had engineered. Because the civic dinner was a city-sanctioned event funded and organized entirely outside the jurisdiction of the public school district, Marcus had absolutely no authority over the invitation list. He could not threaten my teaching credential for attending an event explicitly requested by the mayor. If Marcus attempted to block the local high school color guard from presenting the American flag at a patriotic dinner he was personally chairing, the political fallout would instantly destroy his upcoming campaign for city council. He was completely neutralized by the very city bureaucracy he was trying to conquer. I accepted the mission. Not because I had any desire to wear formal clothes or rub shoulders with the town elite, because I wanted my kids to stand incredibly tall in front of the exact people who had written them off as a budget liability. I still had absolutely no idea that my own name was resting inside a sealed envelope in a downtown office safe. I assumed this was simply a polite, face-saving gesture from the city. A way to quietly smooth over the highly publicized budget fight from the previous fall. We spent the next 3 afternoons preparing. I selected my 4 most senior cadets. We did not have the expensive, district-funded ceremonial uniforms anymore, but that did not matter. We pressed razor-sharp creases into their cheap khaki pants. We polished their brass belt buckles until they mirrored the ceiling lights. We drilled the slow, synchronized, utterly silent color guard march in the empty parking lot behind the Veterans Hall. I instructed them that no matter what happened in that massive ballroom, no matter who was sitting at the front tables, they were going to deliver absolute perfection. Across town, Marcus was treating the upcoming gala like his own personal coronation. The civic dinner was the single most heavily anticipated social event of the year in our county. It was an evening designed entirely for massive political influence, heavy checkbooks, and aggressive networking. According to the administrative staff at the high school, Marcus spent the entire week behaving as if he had already won a seat on the city council. He bragged loudly about his role as the honorary chairman. He was entirely committed to the theatrical element of the evening. He assumed the independent committee had selected a highly respected elderly retired general, or perhaps a wealthy corporate donor who had served a brief stint in the military reserves decades ago. He saw the ceremony purely as a strategic photo opportunity. Because he wanted his reaction to look incredibly genuine for the local newspaper photographers, he aggressively demanded that the committee keep the winner a complete secret from him until he opened the folder on stage. The event organizers offered to let him privately review the envelope in the green room before the ceremony began. He refused. He was so confident in his political stagecraft that he wanted the live, unscripted reveal. He was completely blind to the trap closing around him. The night of the dinner arrived with a sharp chill in the November air. The grand ballroom of the downtown municipal center was spectacular. Soft lighting reflected off heavy crystal glasses. Over 500 of the most powerful people in the county were seated at massive round tables covered in crisp white linens. I arrived through the back kitchen entrance wearing my formal Air Force Service dress uniform. I made sure the silver ribbons on my chest representing 20 years of managing lethal munitions were perfectly aligned. I ushered my 4 nervous cadets into a small holding room behind the main stage to wait for their cue. I did not mingle. I stayed completely out of sight. The ballroom lights dimmed perfectly at 7:30. A low hush fell over the massive crowd. I gave my senior cadet a firm nod. The heavy double doors swung open. My 4 students marched out onto the main floor. Their steps struck the carpeted floor in terrifying, absolute unison. They navigated the crowded room, presented the heavy flags on the main stage, and executed a flawless, unified salute. The massive ballroom fell perfectly silent in profound respect. When they marched back out of the room, the entire crowd erupted into massive applause. I felt a surge of immense, quiet pride. My job was technically done. I instructed the kids to head out to the charter bus waiting in the alley, fully intending to leave with them. But Thomas suddenly appeared from the hallway and gently pulled me back. He insisted I stay and watch the main presentation from a small chair tucked away in the shadows near the velvet stage curtains. I reluctantly agreed, keeping my profile incredibly low. As I sat down in the darkness, I wondered who the city had actually chosen to honor, completely unprepared for how I was going to react when the night reached its climax. For the next 2 hours, the dinner service dragged on. Finally, the dessert plates were cleared away. The massive chandeliers dimmed entirely, leaving only a blinding white spotlight illuminating the solid oak podium in the center of the main stage. Marcus practically sprinted up the carpeted stairs. He looked immaculate in his expensive custom tuxedo. He adjusted his heavy black bow tie and leaned into the microphone, flashing his perfectly white, entirely empty smile to the crowd. He delivered a 10-minute speech about his own deep personal commitment to honoring local heroes. He talked about sacrifice and leadership using hollow buzzwords. He built the anticipation masterfully, reminding the audience that he had deliberately chosen not to know the identity of the winner until this exact moment, wanting to share the pure surprise with the community. A nervous silence settled over the room. The president of the Chamber of Commerce walked up the side stairs carrying a small silver tray. Resting on the tray was a heavy, dark blue leather presentation folder sealed with a thick red wax stamp. Marcus picked up the heavy folder. He held it high in the air for the press photographers kneeling at the edge of the stage. He announced it was his profound honor to reveal the name of a towering titan of discipline. He cracked the wax seal with his thumb. From my quiet seat in the shadows, I watched him open the heavy leather cover. I watched the exact second his immense, arrogant confidence completely shattered. It was a brilliant, devastating physical reaction. Marcus was a man who survived entirely on smooth political control. But as his eyes traced the first typed paragraph resting inside the heavy folder, his jaw muscles tightened so violently I could see them jump from 40 feet away. His carefully manicured hands began to tremble. His perfect posture collapsed his shoulders, hunching slightly forward as if he had just absorbed a massive physical blow to his chest. He looked frantically over his shoulder at the Chamber of Commerce president. He desperately wanted to argue. He wanted to claim there had been a terrible administrative mistake. But the president simply smiled proudly and gestured toward the microphone, totally oblivious to his rising panic. The entire grand ballroom was completely silent, waiting for him to speak. The flashbulbs from the local press photographers popped brightly at the edge of the stage, capturing his terrified expression in high definition. He was completely trapped. The strict protocol of the evening, the live press coverage, and his own massive political ego forced his hand. He could not throw the folder down and storm off the stage without completely destroying his upcoming city council campaign on the evening news. He had aggressively demanded the exclusive right to read the winner file entirely blind. He had demanded the spotlight. Therefore, he had to suffer the consequences. He took a ragged, shallow breath. He leaned into the live microphone. When he finally spoke, his smooth, booming baritone had entirely vanished. His voice sounded thin, brittle, and defeated. This year, the city has chosen to recognize a career of profound logistical mastery and unyielding combat discipline, Marcus choked out. He was reading the unredacted official citation the independent committee had prepared from my service file. He was forced to read my actual rank. He was forced to read the exact staggering tonnage of high explosives my munitions team had actively managed during 3 consecutive combat rotations in the Middle East. He had to read aloud to his wealthy campaign donors that a single error on my flight line would have resulted in the catastrophic loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in military aircraft and countless human lives. Every single word he spoke methodically shattered the babysitting insult he had thrown at me 6 months earlier. The massive ballroom was entirely quiet, absorbing the heavy, serious nature of the combat record. They were listening to a massive military logistics summary being read by a man whose only administrative experience was selling expensive luxury vehicles and trying to build a digital football scoreboard. For 2 decades, Marcus continued, sweat visibly beading on his forehead beneath the hot stage lights. Master Sergeant Margaret instilled order into pure chaos. But her mission did not end when she retired. She brought that same unyielding dedication back to our town. A low murmur of recognition began to ripple through the front tables where the school board members were seated. Thomas, sitting directly at the center table, did not make a single sound. He simply folded his hands and watched the podium with quiet, absolute satisfaction. Marcus turned the heavy page in the folder. His hands were shaking so severely the thick paper audibly rattled near the sensitive microphone. The committee had explicitly included the letter from Sergeant Elias. Marcus swallowed hard. He looked down at the typed copy and began to read the raw, devastating words of the deployed combat infantry soldier. He read how a failing, incredibly angry teenager had been given a new chance at life because of a public high school cadet program. He had to stand there under the blinding hot lights and force out the exact sentence where Elias explicitly credited my unyielding standards with keeping him and his squad alive during an incredibly hostile combat rotation. The dramatic irony in the room was suffocating. Every single person sitting at the massive round tables remembered the highly publicized school board fight from October. They all remembered Marcus leading the charge to completely defund my classroom, calling it a waste of taxpayer money. They were slowly realizing that their honorary chairman was publicly reading a defense of the exact program he had tried to destroy. He read the final line of the letter, his voice cracking slightly on the final syllable. "She did not just teach me how to wear a uniform, she taught me how to save my own life." Marcus stared blankly at the page. The devastating reality of what he had actively tried to ruin was now painfully visible to the entire town elite. He had defunded this program to build a digital scoreboard for his auto group. Every single person in the room suddenly realized exactly what kind of man was standing behind the podium. Marcus raised his head. He looked completely pale. He had to finish the script. He had to summon me to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice entirely hollow, "please join me in honoring our Veteran of the Year, Master Sergeant Margaret." The heavy silence in the ballroom shattered. It did not start as polite applause. It was a massive rolling thunder. 500 people pushed their heavy chairs back, rising to their feet in absolute unison. The applause crashed over the stage like a physical wave. The mayor was standing. The superintendent of the school district was standing. The parents and local business owners were clapping furiously. I stood up slowly from my chair in the shadows. I did not rush. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. I walked out into the blinding white light, the silver ribbons on my uniform catching the aggressive glare of the flashbulbs. I climbed the short carpeted stairs and walked directly toward the podium. I walked directly toward the man who had tried to erase my entire career. Marcus was completely deflated. The aggressive, perfectly manicured school board bully had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, utterly diminished man shrinking under the harsh lights. He looked incredibly small. I stopped directly in front of him. He did not look me in the eye. He looked firmly at the floorboards. He knew in that exact moment that his entire political future was resting entirely in my hands. He assumed I was going to humiliate him. He assumed I was going to use the massive public platform to expose his cruel threats and demand his immediate resignation from the school board. I simply reached out and calmly took the heavy leather folder from his hands. His hand was trembling violently as he slowly held out the live microphone, offering it to me for my speech. I stood alone behind the solid oak podium, resting my hands on the edge of the heavy leather folder. The massive standing ovation from the crowd finally slowly faded away, replaced by a deep, expectant silence. 500 pairs of eyes were locked directly on me. Every single person in the grand ballroom knew the exact history between the man standing beside me and the military file he had just been forced to recite. They were waiting for the execution. They expected me to demand his immediate resignation. They expected me to weaponize the open microphone and completely dismantle him for calling my 20-year Air Force career glorified babysitting. Marcus took a very slow, terrified step backward. He looked like a man bracing for a physical impact. He knew I held all the ammunition. But true discipline is not just knowing how to completely destroy an adversary. It is knowing exactly when to hold your fire. I am a logistics officer. I do not deal in messy public drama. I deal in long-term tactical solutions. My ultimate mission was not about my personal pride or humiliating a fragile local politician. My mission was entirely about securing a safe, structured future for the 70 teenagers in my program. I leaned forward toward the microphone. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the exact same calm, measured tone I used to brief my flightline crews in the Middle East. I accept this profound honor on behalf of Sergeant Elias, I said, my voice echoing clearly across the quiet, crystal-lit room. And I accept it on behalf of the 70 incredible high school cadets who currently spend their weekend afternoons cleaning up the local cemetery in cheap blue polo shirts simply because they believe in the quiet power of serving their community. I paused, letting the heavy truth settle over the wealthy donors and the school board members sitting in the front rows. I did not mention the budget cuts. I did not mention the cruel insults. The dramatic contrast between a deployed combat veteran and the petty, sweating politician standing to my left was already incredibly obvious to everyone in the room. Then I turned my head slightly and looked directly at Marcus. He flinched, pulling his expensive tuxedo jacket tightly against his chest. The school board has incredibly difficult financial decisions to make every single year, I continued, keeping my tone perfectly respectful. It is a massive administrative burden, but true leadership requires understanding the exact value of the assets you are managing. So I would like to publicly extend a formal invitation to our honorary chairman. I smiled, a quiet, terrifyingly polite smile. Marcus, before you draw any more lines through the district budget next spring, I invite you to come down to the asphalt parking lot behind the Veterans Hall. Come stand with us in the cold on a Saturday morning. Watch these kids run their drills. Come see exactly what we are building. I think you might be profoundly surprised by their discipline. I did not demand his surrender. I simply demanded his participation. The ballroom erupted into applause, again, this time laced with warm, knowing laughter. It was a perfectly executed, completely polite checkmate. I had publicly handed him an incredibly easy escape route, but the massive trap was fully sealed. If he refused my warm public invitation, his political campaign would instantly collapse. If he accepted, he would be forced to acknowledge the immense value of the exact program he had tried to destroy. I stepped back from the microphone, picked up the heavy presentation folder, and gave the massive crowd a single, crisp nod. I turned and walked calmly off the bright stage. I left Marcus standing there under the hot spotlight, totally stunned by his own survival, entirely exposed to the judgment of his peers. The consequences arrived entirely on their own schedule. I never had to say another harsh word to him. The local Sunday newspaper published a massive front-page article about the civic dinner. They printed a large photograph of my unredacted service file sitting right next to the 3-page letter from Sergeant Elias. The immense public pressure generated by the town was immediate and completely overwhelming. The angry parents finally had the absolute proof they needed to demand total accountability from the school board. 2 weeks later, the district quietly held an emergency, unpublicized morning administrative session. They officially reversed the autumn vote. They fully and permanently restored the $24,000 operating budget to the cadet program for the upcoming academic year. They quietly buried the massive digital football scoreboard proposal, citing a sudden lack of private funding. Marcus never visited my weekend drill practice, but he also never bothered us again. The incredible humiliation of having to recite my combat history completely broke his iron grip on the board. His massive political campaign for the city council quietly fizzled out before the primary elections. He eventually faded away, retreating to his luxury car dealerships. The following September, I unlocked the heavy door to my old high school classroom. 70 brand new, incredibly sharp district uniforms were hanging on the long metal racks against the far wall. The filing cabinets were fully stocked, The loud morning bell rang, and a new group of freshmen marched through my double doors, looking terrified and entirely unorganized. I closed the door, smoothed the crisp front of my dark blue polo shirt, and picked up my attendance clipboard. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. We had an immense amount of work to do. Sometimes, the loudest, most arrogant people in the room desperately want you to meet their chaos with anger. They assume their expensive suit or their fancy title gives them absolute authority over your reality. But you never have to play their game. When someone tells you that your life work is entirely useless, do not panic and do not retreat. Gather your quiet proof. Keep doing the hard, invisible work when nobody is looking. Trust that an unyielding history of honest discipline is the heaviest armor you will ever wear. Eventually, the absolute truth will demand the microphone, and their own massive ego will force them to announce your victory aloud. If my story about outlasting a school board bully reminded you that true respect is always earned through quiet grit, I would be deeply grateful if you subscribed to the channel and joined our growing community. I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you handle people who severely underestimate your quiet dedication? Do you think keeping it completely polite on that stage was the right tactical move? Or did he deserve a harsher public humiliation? I review every single comment. Stick around because in the next video, we are going to look at a small-town bank manager who tried to alter a military widow and her mortgage documents, completely unaware she had kept every single original carbon copy in a safe deposit box. Thank you incredibly much for listening, and I will see you in the next one.